Hey everybody, Danahey-Feil here. So in the last few chapters that we've read, we've had the loss of Kiowa, we've had the being buried in the literally shit field, and really the guilt of Norman Bowker that he couldn't save Kiowa, and his desperate want to have that story of how that action continued to affect his life for years afterwards, and in fact, more than likely led to his suicide. And how Tim, the writer O'Brien, used that story first in a way that didn't work, and then finally in this book using it in a way it did work, in attaching Norman Bowker's name to it, giving in. And you can really see, now you're really beginning to see that metaphorical, so not really tangible or something we can hold on to. But nevertheless, it's a something, a guilt, shame, and how those can, after a while, just have that their own physical weight that you are carrying with you throughout the war. We've seen it with Jimmy Cross and being all in love with his girlfriend and, not paying attention when one of his men got shot. And we've seen more than that. We've seen his guilt at killing that kid on the road that he probably, could have gotten away with that killing. We've seen Norman Bowker's shame and guilt in not being able to save Kiowa. So keep that in mind and how they are presenting it and how in some ways they need to talk about it. And Tim has talked about that also, the fact that that's why he keeps writing war stories, is because he needs to exercise these feelings within himself also to be a healthier human being. Okay, so we're going to read the next chapter called In the Field. Let me just share my screen here. All right, so in the field. At daybreak, a platoon of 18 soldiers formed a loose rank and began tramping side by side through the deep muck of the shit field. They moved slowly in the rain, leaning forward, heads down. They used the butt of their weapons as probes, waiting, looking for bodies, literally, wading across the field to the river and then turning and wading back again. They were all tired and miserable. All they wanted now was it to be finished. Kiowa was gone. He was under the mud and water, folded in with the war, and their only thought was to find him and dig him out and then move him on to someplace dry and warm. It had been a hard night, maybe the worst ever. The rains had fallen without stop, and the Saint-Trebang had overflowed its banks, and the muck had now risen thigh deep along the river. A low gray mist hovered over the land. Off to the west, there was thunder, little moaning sounds, and the monsoon seemed to be a lasting element of the war. The 18 soldiers moved in silence. First, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross went first, and then straightening out the rank, closing the gaps. His uniform was dark with mud. His arms and face were filthy. Early in the morning, he had radioed in the MIA report, missing in action, giving the name and circumstances. He was now determined to find his man, no matter what, even if it meant flying in slabs of concrete and damming up the river and draining the entire field. He would not lose a member of his command like this. It wasn't right. Kiowa had been a fine soldier and a fine human being and a devout Baptist, and there was no way Lieutenant Cross would allow such a good man to be lost under the slime of a shit field. Briefly, he stopped and watched the clouds. Except for some occasional thunder, it was a deeply quiet morning. Just as the rain and the steady sloshing sounds of 18 men wading through the thick waters. Lieutenant Cross wished the rain would let up. Even for an hour, it would make things easier. But then he shrugged. The rain was the war, and you had to fight it. Turning, he looked across the field and yelled at one of his men to close up rank. Not a man, really, a boy. A young soldier stood off by himself at the center of the field in knee-deep water, reaching down with both hands as if chasing some object just beneath the surface. The boy's shoulders were shaking. Jimmy Cross yelled again, but the young soldier did not turn or look up. In his hooded poncho, everything caked with mud, the boy's face was impossible to make out. The filth seemed to erase identities, transforming the men into identical copies of a single soldier, which was exactly how Jimmy Cross had been trained to treat them, as interchangeable units of command. It was difficult sometimes, but he tried to avoid that sort of thinking. He had no military ambitions. He preferred to view his men not as units, but as human beings. And Kiowa had been a splendid human being, the very best, intelligent and gentle and quiet spoken. Very brave too, and decent. The kid's father taught Sunday school in Oklahoma City, where Kiowa had been raised to believe in the promise of salvation through Jesus Christ. And the conviction had always been present in the boy's smile, in his posture toward the world, in the way he never went anywhere without an illustrated New Testament that his father had mailed to him as a birthday present back in January. A crime, Jimmy Cross thought. Looking out toward the river, he knew for a fact that he had made a mistake setting up here. The order had come from higher, true, but still, he should have exercised some field discretion. He should have moved to higher ground for the night, should have radioed in false coordinates. But there was nothing he could do now. But still, it was a mistake, a hideous waste. He felt sick about it. Standing in the deep waters of the field, First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross composing a letter in his head to the kid's father, not mentioning the shit field, just saying what a fine soldier Keo had been, what a fine human being, and how he was the kind of son that any father could be proud of forever. The search went slowly. For a time, the morning seemed to brighten, the sky going a little lighter shade of silver, but then the rains came back hard and steady. There was a feel of permanent twilight. At the far left, Azar and Norman Bowker and Mitchell Sanders waited along the edge of the field closest to the river. They were tall men, but at times the muck came to mid-thigh, other times to their crotch. Azar kept shaking his head. He coughed and shook his head. Man, talk about irony. I bet if Kiowa was here, he'd just laugh. Eating shit, it's your classic irony. Fine, Norman Becker said, now pipe down. Azar said, wasted in the waste, he said, a shit field. You got to admit, it's pure class world irony. The three men moved with slow, heavy steps. It was hard to keep their balance. Their boots sank into the ooze, which produced a powerful downward suction. In each step, they would have to pull up hard to break that hold. The rain made quick dents in the water like tiny mouths, and the stink was everywhere. When they reached the river, they shifted a few meters to the north and began wading back up into the field. Occasionally, they used their weapons to test the bottom, but mostly they just searched with their feet. A classic case, Azar was saying, fighting in the dirt, so to speak. That tells the story. Enough, Bowker said. Like those old cowboy movies, one more redskin bites the dirt. I'm serious, man. Zip it shut. Azar smiled. Classic. The morning was cold and wet. They had not slept during the night, not even for a few moments, and all three of them were feeling the tension as they moved across the field to the river. There was nothing they could do for Kiowa, just find him and slide him aboard a chopper. When a man died, it was always the same, a desire to get it over with quickly, no frills or ceremony. And what they wanted now was to head for the Ville and get under a roof and forget that what had happened during the night. Halfway across the field, Mitchell Sanders stopped. He stood for a moment with his eyes shut, feeling along the bottom with a foot. Then he passed his weapon over to Norman Bowker and reached down into the muck. After a second, he hauled up a scummy green rucksack. The three men did not speak for a time. The pack was heavy with mud and water, dead looking. Inside, there were a pair of moccasins and an illustrated New Testament. Well, Mitchell Sanders finally said, the guy's around here somewhere. Better tell the LT. Screw him. Yeah, but some lieutenant, Sanders said. Camps us in a toilet. That man don't know shit. Nobody knew, Bowker said. Maybe so, maybe not. 10 billion places we could have set up last night. The man picks a latrine. Norman Bowker stared down at the rucksack. It was made of dark green nylon with an aluminum frame, but now it had a curious look of flesh. It wasn't the LT's fault, Bowker said quietly. Whose then? Nobody knew till afterward. Mitchell Sanders made a sound in his throat. He hoisted up the rucksack, slipped the harness, and pulled the straps tight. All right, but this much is for sure. The man knew it was raining. He knew about the river. 1 plus 1 added up. You get exactly what happened. Sanders glared at the river. Move it, he said. Kia was waiting on us. Slowly then, bending against the rain, Azar and Norman Bowker and Mitchell Sanders began wading again through the deep waters, their eyes down, circling out where they had found the rucksack. First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross stood 50 meters away. He had finished writing the letter in his head, explaining things to Kiowa's father, and he now folded his arms and watched his platoon crisscrossing the wide field. In a funny way, it reminded him of the municipal golf course in his hometown of New Jersey. A lost ball, he thought, tired players searching through the rough, sweeping back and forth in long, systematic patterns. He wished he were there right now, on the sixth hole, looking out at some water hazard that fronted the small flat green, a 7-iron in his hand, calculating wind distance, wondering if he should have reached an 8 for an 8, a tough decision, but all you could ever lose was a ball. You didn't lose a player, and you never had to wade out into a hazard and spend the day searching for the slime. Jimmy Cross did not want the responsibility of leading these men. He had never wanted it. In his sophomore year at Sebastian College, he had signed up for the Reserve Officer Training Corps without much thought, an automatic thing because his friends had joined, and because it was worth a few credits, and because it seemed preferable to letting a draft take him. He was not unprepared, 24 years old, and his heart wasn't in it. Military matters meant nothing to him. He did not care one way or the other about the war. He had no desire to command. And even after all these months in the bush, all the days and nights, even then, he did not know enough to keep his men out of a shit field. What he should have done, he told himself, was follow his first impulse. In the late afternoon yesterday, when they reached the night coordinates, he should have taken one look and headed for higher ground. No excuses. At one edge of the field, it was a small ville. Right away, a couple of mama sons had trotted out to warn him. Number 10, they'd said, evil ground. But it was a war. He had his orders. So he set up a perimeter and crawled under their ponchos and tried to settle for the night. He remembered how the water kept rising, how the terrible stink began to swell up out of the earth. It was a dead fish smell partly, but something else too. And late in the night, Mitchell Sanders had crawled through the rain and grabbed him hard by the arm and asked what he was doing setting up in a ship field. The village toilet, Sanders said, and remembered the look on Sanders' face. The guy stared at him a moment and then wiped his mouth and whispered, shit, and crawled back away in the dark. A stupid mistake. That's all it was, a mistake. But it had killed Kiowa. Lieutenant Jimmy Cross felt something tighten inside him. In a letter to Kiowa's father, he would apologize point blank, just admit to the blunders. He would place the blame where it belonged. Tactically, he'd say it was indefensible ground from the start, low and flat, no natural color, no natural cover. And so late at night, when they took mortar fire from across the river, all they could do was snake down under the slop and lie there and wait. The field just exploded. Rain and slop and shrapnel all mixed together, and the field seemed to boil. He would explain this to Kiowa's father, carefully, not covering up his own guilt. He would tell how the mortar rounds made craters in the slush, spraying up great showers of filth, and how craters then collapsed in on themselves and filled up with mud and water, sucking things down, swallowing things, weapons and trenching tools and belts of ammunition. And how, in this way, his son Kiowa had been combined with the waste and the war. My own fault, he would say. Straightening up, First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross rubbed his eyes and tried to get his thoughts together. The rain fell in a cold, sad drizzle. Off toward the river, he again noticed the young soldier standing alone in the center of the field. The boy's shoulders were shaking. Maybe it was something of a posture of the soldier, or maybe he seemed to be reaching for some invisible object beneath the surface. But for several moments, Jimmy Cross stood very still, afraid to move, yet knowing he had to. And then he murmured to himself, my fault, and he nodded and waded across the field toward the boy. The young soldier was trying hard not to cry. He too blamed himself. Bent forward at the waist, groping with both hands, he seemed to be chasing some creature just beyond reach, something elusive, a fish or a frog. His lips were moving. Like Jimmy Cross, he was explaining things to an absent judge. He wasn't, it wasn't to defend himself. The boy recognized his own guilt and wanted only to lay out the full causes. Wading sideways a few steps, he leaned down and felt along the bottom of the field. He pictured Kiowa's face. They'd been close buddies, the tightest, and he remembered how they had huddled together under their ponchos, the cold rain and steady, the water rising to their knees, but how Kiowa had just laughed it off and said they should concentrate on better things. And so after a long while, they talked about their families and hometowns. At one point, the boy remembered he'd been showing Kiowa a picture of his girlfriend. He remembered switching on his flashlight, a stupid thing to do, but he did it anyway. And he remembered Kiowa leaning in for a look at the picture. Hey, she's cute, it said. And then the field exploded all around them. Like murder, the boy thought. The flashlight made it happen, dumb and dangerous. And as a result, his friend Kiowa was dead. That's simple, he thought. He wished there was some other way to look at it, but there wasn't. Very simple and very final. He remembered 2 mortar rounds hitting close by, then a third even closer, and off to his left he'd heard someone scream. The voice was ragged and clotted up, but he knew instantly that it was Kiowa. He remembered trying to crawl toward the screaming. No sense of direction, though, and the field seemed to suck him under, and everything was black and wet, and he couldn't get his bearings. And then another round hit nearby. And for a few moments, all he could do was hold his breath and duck down beneath the water. Later, when he came up again, there was no more screams. There was an arm and a wristwatch and part of a boot. There were bubbles where Kiowa's head should have been. He remembered grabbing the boot. He remembered pulling it hard, but how the field seemed to pull back like a tug of war he couldn't win, and how finally he had to whisper his friend's name and let go and watch the boot slide away. Then for a long time, there were things he could not remember, various sounds, various smells. Later, he found himself lying on a little rise, face up, tasting the field in his mouth, listening to the rain and explosions and bubbling sounds. He was alone. He had lost everything. He'd lost Kiowa and his weapon and his flashlight and his girlfriend's picture. He remembered this. He remembered wondering if he could lose himself. Now, in the dull morning rain, the boy seemed frantic. He waded quickly from spot to spot, leaning down, plunging his hands in the water. He did not look up when Jimmy Cross approached. Right here, the boy was saying. He's got to be right here. Jimmy Cross remembered the kid's face, but not his name. That happens sometimes. He tried to treat his men as individuals, but sometimes the names just escaped him. He watched the young soldier shove his hands into the water. Right here, he kept saying. His movement seemed random and jerky. Jimmy Cross waited a moment and then stepped closer. Listen, he said quietly. The guy could be anywhere. The boy glanced up. Who could? Kiowa. You can't expect. Kiowa's dead. Well, yes, the young soldier nodded. So what about Billy? Who? My girl. What about her? The picture. It was the only one I had. Right here, I lost it. Jimmy Cross shook his head. It bothered him that he could not come up with a name. Slow down, he said. Billy's picture. I had it all wrapped up. I had it in plastic, so it would be okay if I can. Last night we were looking at it, me and Kiowa, right here. I know for sure it's right here somewhere. Jimmy Cross smiled at the boy. You can ask her for another one, a better one. She won't send another word. She's not my girl anymore. She won't. Man, I gotta find it. The boy yanked his arm free. He shuffled sideways and stooped down again, dipped into the muck with both hands. His shoulders were shaking. Briefly, Lieutenant Cross wondered where the kid's weapon was and his helmet, but it seemed better not to ask. He felt some pity come on him. For the moment of the day seemed to soften. So much hurt, he thought. He watched the young soldier wading through the water, bending down, then standing, then bending down again, as if something might finally be savaged from all his waist. Jimmy Cross silently wished the boy luck. And then he closed his eyes and went back to working on the letter to Kiowa's father. Across the field, Azar, Norman Backer, and Mitchell Sanders were waiting alongside a narrow dike at the edge of the field. It was near noon now. Norman Backer found Kiowa. He was under 2 feet of water. Nothing showed except for the heel of a boot. That's him, Azar said. Who else? I don't know. Azar shook his head. I don't know. Norman Bowker touched the boot, covered his eyes for a moment, then stood up and looked at Azar. So where's the joke? He said. No joke. Eating shit. Let's hear that one. Forget it. Mitchell Sanders told him to knock it off. The three soldiers moved to the dike, put down their packs and weapons, waded back to where the boot was showing. The body lay partly wedged under a layer of mud beneath the water. It was hard to get traction. With each movement, the muck would grip the feet and hold tight. The rain had come back harder now. Mitchell Sanders reached down and found Kiowa's other boot, and they waited a moment. Then Sanders sighed and said, okay. They took a hold of the two boots and pulled hard. There was only a slight give. They tried again, but this time the body did not move at all. After a third try, they stopped and looked down for a while. One more time, Norman Bowker said. He counted to 3, and they leaned back and pulled. Stuck, said Mitchell Sanders. I can see that, Christ. They tried again, then called over Henry Dobbins and Rat Kiley, and all 5 of them put their arms and backs into it, but the body was jammed in tight. Azar moved to the dike and sat holding his stomach. His face was pale. The others stood in a circle, watching the water. After a time, somebody said, we can't just leave him there. The men nodded and got out their entrenching tools and began digging. It was hard, sloppy work. The mud seemed to flow back faster than they could dig, but Kiowa was their friend, and they kept digging at it anyway. Slowly, in little groups, the rest of the platoon drifted over to watch. Only Lieutenant Jimmy Cross and the young soldier were still searching the field. What we should do, I guess, Norman Bowker said, is tell the LT. Mitchell Sanders shook his head. Just mess things up. Besides, the man looked happy out there, real content. Let him be. After 10 minutes, they uncovered most of Kiowa's lower body. The corpse was slightly angled steeply into the muck, upside down, like a diver who had plunged headfirst off a high tower. The men stood quietly for a few seconds. There was a feeling of awe. Mitchell Sanders finally nodded and said, let's get it done. They took a hold of his legs and pulled hard, and then pulled again, and after a moment, Kiowa came sliding to the surface. A piece of his shoulder was missing. The arms and his chest were cut up with shrapnel. He was covered with a bluish-green mud. Well, Henry Dobbins said, it could be worse. And Dave Jensen said, how, man? Tell me how. Carefully, trying not to look at the body, they carried Kiowa over the dike and laid him down. They used towels to clean off the scum. Rat Kiley went through the kid's pockets, placed his personal effects in a plastic bag, taped the bag to Kiowa's wrist, and then used the radio to call in a dust-off. Moving away, the men found things to do with themselves. Some smoking, some opening up cans of sea rations, a few just standing in the rain. For all of them, it was a relief to have it finished. It was the promise now of finding hooch somewhere or an abandoned pagoda where they could strip down, wring out their fatigues, and maybe start a heart fire. They felt bad for Kiowa, but they also felt a kind of giddiness, a secret joy, because they were alive, and because even the rain was preferable to being sucked under a ship field, and because it was all a matter of luck and happenstance. Azar sat down next to Norman Bowker. Listen, he said, those dumb jokes, I didn't mean anything. We all say things. Yeah, but when I saw the guy, it made me feel, I don't know, like he was listening. He wasn't. I guess not, but I sort of felt guilty almost, like if I'd kept my mouth shut, none of this would have happened, like it was my fault. Norman Bowker looked across the field. Nobody's fault, he said. Everybody's. Near the end of the first Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, squatted in the muck, almost entirely submerged. In his head, he was revising the letter to Kiowa's father, impersonal this time, an officer expressing an officer's condolences. No apologies were necessary because, in fact, it was one of those freak things, and the war was full of freaks, and nothing could ever change it that way. Which was the truth, he thought, the exact truth. Lieutenant Cross went deeper into the muck and dark water at his throat and tried to tell himself it was the truth. Beside him, a few steps off to the left, the young soldier was still searching for his girlfriend's picture, still remembering how he had killed Kiowa. The boy wanted to confess. He wanted to tell the lieutenant how in the middle of the night he pulled out Billy's picture and passed it over to Kiowa and then switched on the flashlight. And how Kiowa had whispered, "Hey, she's cute." And how for a second the flashlight made Billy's face sparkle. And how right then the field had exploded all around them. The flashlight had done it, like a target shining in the dark. The boy looked up at the sky, then at Jimmy Cross. "Sir," he said. The rain and mist moved across the field in broad, sweeping sheets of gray. Close by, there was thunder. "Sir," the boy said, "I got to explain something." But Lieutenant Cross wasn't listening. Eyes closed, he let himself go deeper into the waste, just letting the field take him. He lay back and floated. When a man died, there had to be blame. Jenny Cross understood this. You could blame the war. You could blame the idiots who made the war. You could blame Kiowa for going to it. You could blame the rain. You could blame the river. You could blame the field, the mud, the climate. You could blame the enemy. You could blame the mortar rounds. You could blame people who were too lazy to read a newspaper, who were bored by the daily body counts, who switched channels at the mention of politics. You could blame whole nations. You could blame God. You could blame the munition maker or Karl Marx or a trick of fate or an old man in Omaha who forgot to vote. In the field, though, the causes were immediate. In a moment of carelessness or bad judgment or plain stupidity, they carried consequences, and that lasted forever. For a long while, Jimmy Cross lay floating. In the clouds to the east, there was the sound of a helicopter. He didn't take notice. With his eyes still closed, bobbing in the field, he let himself slip away. He was back home in New Jersey, a golden afternoon on a golf course, the fairways lush and green, and he was teeing up on the first hole. It was a world without responsibility. When the war was over, he thought, maybe then he would write a letter to Kiowa's father, or maybe not. Maybe he would just take a couple of practice swings and knock the ball down the middle and pick up his clubs and walk off into the afternoon.